This week, the National Park Service Tour takes us through the Jean Lafitte National Historic Park and Preserve, which stretches across 6 sites in South Louisiana, offering glimpses of the real Cajun country, past and present. Not the fancy, citified Creole lifestyle of New Orleans that gets conflated with Cajun in tourist brochures. The Jean Lafitte set of parks is a nifty flip side to the Acadia parks of Maine I talked about a few weeks back. Those are the Cajuns that stayed as close to their lost home as possible, kept their proper pronunciation, and tidy, cool temperature weather habits. But the ones that went south in search of warmer climates, friendly French Catholics, and maybe an easier farming climate, went south and washed up outside of Nouveau Orleans in the middle of the 18th century, only to have their land invaded, purchased, by the descendants of those same English that kicked them out of Acadia last time. Fun fact, there's an enjoyable Cajun band out there called Le Grand Dérangement. Anyway, the other important thing about this park is the guy it's named after, Jean Lafitte, or Jean Lafitte, the French pirate and privateer who prowled the Gulf of Mexico. Born maybe on Saint-Domingue, that is pre-Haiti, or in Biarritz in the French Basque country on the shores of the Bay of Biscay. He was all mixed up in the chaos of the 19th century, right where we are. And realistically, he was really doing his part to add to it. Smuggling was his game and made him a relatively wealthy man. So of course, when the British showed up in New Orleans as part of the War of 1812, he wanted none of their large navy and competent military administration, so he helped organize the local pirates to fight against them on the side of the Americans, earning his spot as an American folk hero, and getting this park named after him. The 6 parts include a nature preserve on Barataria Island, the smuggling colony Lafitte set up, a visitor center in the Big Bad City, that is, New Orleans, a preserved Civil War battlefield, stay tuned for that in future seasons, and a part of the Atchafalaya Basin, as well as 2 cultural centers full of information on the transformation of Acadians into Cajuns and the variety of livelihood they took up in their new homes. In the most American twist of all, Lafitte, who spelled his name Laffite, has his name consistently misspelled by us Yankees. We insist on a single F and a double T. And of course, Jean Lafitte was a Creole, coming from a successful shipping family. So of course the park named after him is all about the Cajuns. Can you believe Americans did that? Oh yeah, I certainly can. But if you want to get to know southern Louisiana and about the second half of the Acadian story, go check out the Jean Lafitte parks. While you should wait until after hurricane season, don't wait too long. The island and the wetlands are definitely part of the state that are getting inundated by sea level rise due to the earliest stages of global warming. While you'll need to pack the mosquito repellent, you will be able to see the fireflies at night, if you're there in the right season. Episode 97. I thought there were more fish. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the changing fish landscape as the colonies become a country and push at their boundaries, and how fish were thought of and dealt with in a world where there was functionally no refrigeration, and unless it was the dead of winter, no freezers. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that modern fish eating for most people in modern America exists in this weird middle place that was unimaginable to everyone who ate fish before about World War II. Before modern freezing, you either ate fish 2 steps away from fresh and wriggling, or ruthlessly and thoroughly preserved through some set of smoke, salt, wind, and lye, and in just a little bit as a cooked to death canned product. Today, most of us consume fish that is presented as fresh, but has almost always traveled a long way and often a long time from where it was caught. but in the suspended animation of modern freezing technology, so neither super fresh nor super altered by preservation. And as I've pointed out before, we're dealing with a food culture that didn't come from climates that were friendly to fermented fish, the way things were in the Mediterranean or coastal Africa and coastal Asia. So no fermented fish, except for in that black box mystery of anchovy ketchup. Last week, I did say that there was no war fish. Well, and that's not entirely true. In the Navy, you got your share of salt fish for sure, and a bit of it came to the Army. But realistically, in this early period of America, not that much was going to the military, and it definitely was not packed along as an adventure food. Lewis and Clark and their Discovery Corps, they would catch fish and later purchase preserved fish, a sort of pounded dried fish meal from different villages and camps they passed through all across the continent. But all in all, compared to the cod that had been made into the high-quality bacalhau and wind-dried stockfish that fed Basque and Viking seafarers for centuries, the product coming out of American cod processing stations was a bulk product that was comparatively poorly butchered, incompetently salted, and incompletely dried. It tended to go bad, while the stuff from the old country regularly lasted for years. And the difference may have mainly laid in the purpose of these different products. When the Basques were drying and salting their bacalhau and the Vikings hanging their cod out to more or less freeze dry under gray skies, they were looking at the life of their society. This was their fish they were going to eat themselves, or it would be eaten by the warriors, sailors, and fishermen that kept their countries and homes supplied and alive. Bad fish meant the literal death of themselves or someone they knew or loved. But the salt cod of America, that was a cash crop. Sure, salt fish were eaten here, there, and everywhere in the colonies and baby America, but it was one of many things, and honestly mostly showed up if you were holding the short end of the stick in society. That is, you found yourself as a criminal converted to indentured servant, an orphan scooped up into the servant class, part of the enslaved agricultural engine, an ordinary sailor in the British Navy, or maybe it was February and food was really down to the dregs. These were the people most likely to be eating the salt cod of America. The bulk of it was processed in New England and sold abroad. And while the highest quality stuff could make its way to Europe and feed those goofy Catholics on all those hundreds of their silly fast days, but most of it was a lower quality product and as a result was sent to the Caribbean to be transmuted into sugar. The American fish processing in fact undercut European dried cod generally in price and would lower the quality of dried cod globally in a sad race for the bottom and an emptying of the Atlantic of a fish that at one point had seemed positively endless. Evidence that the salt fish made here was mostly not consumed here is that there are almost no recipes for salt fish in American cookery, up or down the economic ladder. Even smoked fish was a rarity, except in ethnic enclaves that didn't really make a dent on the mainstream of the early American diet. England has a past with plenty of smoked fish, but the average early American had only encountered smoked fish from the cruddier end of the spectrum, say badly kippered or smoked herring, as a food of the poor. And just like the commodity salt cod America was manufacturing, workhouse herring wasn't anything anyone wanted to recreate for their own use. So in these early years of America, preserved fish, while eaten in a few places or at a few times of year, was not common, not loved, and recipes for its use were rarely recorded. It was fresh fish that ruled. And why not? Everywhere the colonists arrived had an almost unbelievable abundance of fish. If not all the time, then at least seasonally. Catching fish by just dipping the oceans with baskets was a selling point advertised by the John Smith expeditions. And many an early colonist and explorer made note of the fact they could draw fish out of streams with a spear or a stick, or catch it with the simplest net or the very most basic hook and line. And such a state of affairs was repeatedly unbelievable to them, for the fishing streams and rivers of Europe and England, except in the wildest parts, were fairly fished out. Hard to believe it now, but there had once been salmon runs all over continental Europe. Atlantic salmon had run up rivers into France and Germany at one time, the way they still, at least a bit, make their way into the wildest parts of Scotland. But those salmon runs and many other sorts of fish were done in by the use of populated European rivers as a dumping ground for the sewage and increasing industrial waste of the growing cities. These waterways not only suffered from the effluvia of thousands and then millions of humans directly, but the growing concentration of dyers and fullers, that is, cloth processors, paper makers, slaughterhouses, tanneries, and then iron furnaces, forges, gunpowder makers, and saltworks, and so on. The fish soon didn't have a chance. Inland fish from rivers and streams became incredibly rare, and so the fish pond systems and the reserve streams on a state soon contained nearly all the freshwater fish that were eaten in Europe, which meant by the 18th and 19th century, they were only food for the rich or those who lived on the wildest fringes, and all anyone else ever saw was the smoked and salted and dried fish that came in from the sea. Which meant that the bounty of freshwater fish, say catfish or trout or any manner of fish from the Great Lakes and the seasonal runs of salmon and shad and so on that were teeming in the waterways of North America, absolutely stunned the colonists. As I said back in earlier seasons, fish was for everyone. And in these early days of the emerging scientific method, natural philosophers, doctors, and naturalists were only just beginning to vaguely grapple with the idea that fish didn't spontaneously generate from water, or mud, or seagrass, or whatever. And the average person likely never considered the source of fish at all. So why? In this obvious endless bounty of fish, in this land Europeans were apparently biblically destined to be the masters of, why would anyone spend any time worrying about the quality of life of fish? And so they didn't. Just as they had done in the old country, the colonists and the new Americans saw all running water as fair game to be used as sewers, or as water to be run through dye works and tanneries and a place to dump the sawdust from sawmills, to be redirected to run bellows and all manner of other mills. Thinking about the water as the home for fish. Only a few weirdos did that. In fact, these were the very ideas of those Indians, those savage red men. They espoused those in ways that were the most alien of all. To take time in this rush to harvest the bounty of the land, to think about the land and the water themselves as something that needed to be cared for on a large scale, this seemed like a crazy pagan idea. One would sound odd going on about fish spirits or something. It's almost like these uncivilized heathens wanted to stand in the way of progress over some imaginary, fish babies. And so, in this age of mercantilism and colonialism and gathering the riches of the whole wide world at their feet, the idea of thinking about later, or what humans might owe back to the earth and its creatures, well, it didn't bear thinking about. For this time of war and conquest was also the rise of biblical literalism. As printing had become mechanized and the Bibles in the languages of the people who were reading them, they spread. After hundreds of years of being restricted to mainly Latin and some Greek and Hebrew versions, the Bible was starting to appear in all the written languages of the earth: English, Celtic languages, French dialects, Germanic tongues, Russian, Spanish, and as missionaries began to spread about the earth for the Catholic Church, versions in Chinese, Japanese, Malay, and many previously unknown languages of the Americas and Africa. In fact, more than one language would be first transcribed into writing through this process during the 19th century and sometimes earlier. We'll return to this strange process later. but being able to actually read the words of the Bible themselves caused many people to become very literal about them. The sense of metaphor and parable they had held when the entire Bible was a story told through many layers, it was changed for many societies. And for some people, suddenly, the same certainty and precision that was being applied to the natural world with the new science, that same way of considering the Word of God made sense. Okay, this is now in danger of turning into a whole different podcast, but in these days of discovery and acquisition, what really mattered here, for the fish of New America anyway, they are the first animal mentioned when God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all of the earth." Right there, right at the beginning of Genesis. And so, for almost every New American, they simply took it to mean the fish was here for them. Your average American at this point spared very little thought for the fish, except possibly wondering why there seemed to be fewer of them when their parents or their grandparents had arrived. See, if there's one thing that has been a constant refrain in American exploration and occupation of the North American continent, it's noticing the constant and seemingly unstoppable reduction of animal life. And fish were one of the first on the list of what people noticed. It used to be that there were enough cod, salmon, and shad and so on that one could walk on them in their season. Feeding lobsters to the poor and prisoners was a thing because shoals of lobsters 2 feet long and greater would just wash up on beaches. And now we have to hunt them down underwater. In those very earliest colonial days, and of course well before then, children could dip Atlantic cod out of the water with baskets on the American shore, and now somehow we are having to fish them somewhere between delicately and not at all. During their lifetimes, colonists and early Americans watched as streams clogged with sawdust and lost their abundant fish. What had been wide rivers of abundance running through cities became fishless as well, and people had to venture back into the country to find fish. And so by the end of the 19th century, the idea of stocking fish would be an idea tried out to the great dismay of other parts of the ecosystems. And still, the idea that streams, rivers, and the land itself needed some caring for would remain an odd and often disdained idea. The Atlantic salmon as large as children, which astounded the early explorers, became a rare catch on the shores of America by the end of the 18th century and would be gone by the end of the 19th, no matter how far up into Maine one ventured. Until recently, an Atlantic salmon run coming up an American stream was a fairy tale. Though in the last few decades of the 21st century, efforts have succeeded in returning a few runs to the state of Maine. The number of salmon climbed all the way back up into the several hundred, to occasionally breaking into the range of over 1,000, but that was it. Because that's what it came down to. At the birth of America, the idea of mining the landscape for earthly riches carried on. It's just that instead of shipping the wealth back to England, it would stay here. But like the soil and the forest and the streams and the lakes and the freshwater fish and the ocean fish, these were all seen as things here for the taking, and nothing needed to be given back. Now, before this whole thing goes entirely off the rails, it's not that these people were sitting around just twirling their mustaches and planning the demise of landscapes. Rather, there were just so many kinds of overexcited thought going on, all layered atop one another. That's what was really doing in the fish. Back in season 1, I touched on the idea that America was neither colonized nor started by people with a strong connection to land, especially to a particular piece of land. There were the early problems of not being farmers and skipping over the need to care for soil when growing nutrient-hungry crops of tobacco and grain. And then after that, there were the plantation schemes for sugar and grapes and olives taken on by people who didn't have a handle on what those crops needed in terms of climate and soil. In the end, the people with the biggest ideas driving the early farming policy of the country were investors instead of stewards of the land. And you can see the difference. If you looked around at the other colonial efforts of, say, the Spanish, they had established rather astounding farming empires with gardens that yielded both exotic foods and medicines and vistas of beauty. And the French colonial efforts, while no less brutal than the American and Spanish, did spawn a much wider range of gardened foodstuffs at the same time American gardens were shrinking in variety, because the Americans were in a hurry. The goal was to get rich and to get big. Land was a resource rather than a home. And this is why I keep returning to this idea of a way. America from its very start has always operated from the idea if this doesn't work out in this place, we'll just go somewhere else that does. And there was nothing in those early years of the country other than the survivable discomfort of living in rough cabins and chilly or overheated shelters that made this whole operation seem like a bad idea. Okay, it's true, there were people who already lived here, and quite astonishingly beautiful people, if those early reports were to be believed. And they kept saying, hey, we're already using that land. But as far as the colonists and the early Americans were concerned, they weren't turning a profit. They were slow. And so they were generally ruthlessly swept aside. Because keeping to conditions that was working for the original people of the Americas and the fish, that wasn't going to get anybody rich. It didn't allow for lumber mills or iron mines or dye works and so on, at least not in the ways that our 18th century early Americans thought those things needed to be run to get rich. After all, it was obvious once you were done with this area and you'd sucked all the nutrients out or cut down all the trees or scooped up all the fish and sent them away for sugar and profit, you could just move on. Somewhere else that still had land in plenty. After all, in the years right around 1800, it certainly appeared that there was no end of places one could move to where the fish ran thick and the streams ran clear. I mean, look at what Lewis and Clark came back with. It had taken them 3 years to walk to the other side of the world and back. How could people ever fill that up or eat up all the fish? Now, next season, I'll talk more about how people were eating their fish as it starts to change with the slow arrival of the modern world. But for now, we're stuck with these harbingers of fish going from plentiful to being, well, some work to find. Next week, salt reappears, right up there with gunpowder. Salt was an essential element of these early war years. In fact, there will be times when one is substituted for the other. To hear me talk about all that and how hard it is to make salt in the winter on the coast of Oregon, join me next week. Thanks for listening. As always, I enjoy chatting with people about any further questions they have about these episodes. You can contact me on my email, thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. If you're enjoying the show, be sure to download it and leave me reviews so I know you're out there. If you want to hear more of me, come over and join me and my co-host Jamie Lewis on Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters as we dive headlong into the madness of the 19th century, the later years anyway, and soon some early ones. Right now, we are in the thick of season 1 of the HBO show Warrior that mixes Gold Rush and Railroad and San Francisco with fantastical kung fu. And I will be talking about the 4 W's of butter substitutes at the Intelligent Speech Online conference this November 4th. Tickets are available already. Links for all these things will be in the show notes. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me mainly on Instagram and Threads and occasionally on other places on the internet as well as at THoAFood. And of course, as always, all of this is in the show description.